There we go. There we go. Thank you very much, Elsa, for that introduction, and thanks to Rob and Elsa for inviting me to speak today. As Elsa said, I'm the director of GEMA, Garden Industry Manufacturers Association. So we are, like she says, hopefully a proactive organisation working with suppliers of gardening products, and we're very much focused on the retail sector. I've worked in the sector for about 22 years myself, 9 years in my current role, and like Elsa said before that, I was working for a supplier in marketing. So I'm not an academic. I very much approach this from a commercial position, and I'll hopefully share a little bit about my knowledge of the garden retail sector and how we operate. So I will. So yeah, I'm here to really show you an example of an area of retail that is very well aware of its older customer base, and in fact designs much of its retail environment around the needs of that particular customer. I'm very pleased to say that garden retail is a very buoyant sector, and when I refer to garden retail, I am talking about garden centres, high street DIY, online and mail order channels as well. But really, for the purposes today, I'm going to focus on garden centres. So I will, I'll just give you a little bit of background about the sector, a bit of the history and the demographics. I'll talk about the health and well-being benefits of gardening, hopefully preaching to the converted on the call today. I'll talk a little bit about garden centre accessibility as well, the practicalities of garden centre spaces. And also touch on the social importance of garden centres. And finally, you know, there are always ways in which we can improve. So it's areas that we want to work harder and better and be better at. So just a bit of history. I think our sector's probably been around since around the 1970s, when you started to hear more about sort of market gardens. And then those over time have then developed into what we would now refer to as garden centres today. We have many legacy centres around the UK, all of which have sort of grown on the back of plant nurseries. And over time, those centres have been, those owners have sort of bolted on retail space and restaurant space. But more increasingly now, what you do find is as well sort of brand new purpose-built garden centres built from scratch. And according to the latest sort of market monitor from Euromonitor International, the garden retail market in 2022 was worth £5.6 billion. So it's a big sector. And if you split that down, probably half of that, just over half of that would be plants and horticulture. So that's about 2.9 billion. And then the rest would be 2.7 billion. And that would cover products, garden care, fertilizers, equipment, furniture and barbecues. So, you know, straight away, it's a big commercial sector. And I think in 2020 and 2021, we saw a huge growth in our sector. We saw around 20% growth, obviously, during the pandemic. And we welcomed about 3 million new gardeners during lockdown, when people found themselves at home with more time on their hands and they were stuck at home. And as a sector, we were recognised by the government during lockdown and given essential retail status, allowing us to trade and satisfy the huge demand during that time. And we also benefited from being referred to as safe retail spaces. And that's because we have plenty of space, we have open air, and you know, there's a lot of space to allow distance between shoppers. But as the world opened up, obviously, we lost some of those converts, sadly, but I'm pleased to say that we have still managed to maintain them. And so we do see a very definite growth trajectory, get that word right, of about 6 to 8% annual growth over the next few years. So it's still all good for us. And as an industry, we're absolutely obsessed with the weather. We're hugely seasonal, regardless of the sort of economic or the macroeconomic environment. We're always waiting for the sun to shine and the weather to warm up, so that and at that point, which has just happened late this year, we see huge peaks in demand and footfall in garden centres. So this is our sort of key season. In terms of demographics, we don't talk so much about the traditional demographics anymore of our sector, sort of age and socioeconomic strata. It's very much more now focused around tribes, and that's sort of been geared from social media. And I will refer to social media because I don't see there's an age barrier for people who are using social media. And we don't find that in our sector at all. All ages of people are watching people gardening on Instagram and Facebook, etc. So it's, like I say, it's very much around inclusivity and tribes of people who have shared interests and hobbies, regardless of their sort of age and socioeconomic background. Obviously, anecdotally, there is definitely a new generation of gardeners coming through. But having said that, there is absolutely no denying that as a sector, we do rely heavily on empty nesters, semi-retired and retired people who have got more time on their hands and potentially more disposable income to spend on their homes, their gardens and their hobbies. So moving on, health and well-being benefits of gardening. I'm not an expert in this area, but I've referred to experts that are. So, but it is quite well documented. And in particular, the role that gardening played during, during lockdown and the sort of our physical, mental and health and well-being during lockdown as well. In fact, there's quite a famous quote, I don't know if anybody's heard of this before, Sir Muir Gray: everyone needs a natural health service as well as a national health service. And as the population ages and healthcare costs spiral, social prescribing and preventative healthcare will likely take on renewed importance in the country. There was a report commissioned by the National Garden Scheme, a King's Fund report in 2016 that looked into the health and well-being of gardening. And as we get older, our relationship with gardens and gardening changes, and surveys suggest that they become more important to us as a source of physical activity, but also in terms of our identity and independence and in ameliorating loneliness as well. And there's emerging evidence that gardening may also be important in falls prevention, helping to maintain good gait and balance, and also in dementia prevention and cognitive decline. Gardens are intimately connected with our health and well-being across the life course, and this NGS King's Fund report says that there's much more that the health and social care system can do to take advantage of our love affair with gardening. The NHS is increasingly using social prescribing and community referral schemes to refer patients to a range of local, non-clinical services and support in local communities. And a few examples of things like this, it would include reciprocal gardening schemes, which connect isolated older people with untended gardens with those who have no garden but want to garden and grow things. So there's some things there. And also gardens are so important to help the recovery from illness. There are some well-known examples such as Horatio's garden, which provides beautiful gardens as part of therapy for patients who are recovering from spinal injuries. And most dementia studies, like I said, report that exposure to gardens reduces agitation, aggression, and other symptoms. As well as the obvious benefits of exercise, it's also reported that research studies show significant reductions in depression and anxiety and improved social functioning. And in fact, the RHS in 2021 released research that revealed those who garden every day have well-being scores 6.6% higher and stress levels 4.2% lower than people who don't garden at all. There's some really interesting stats out there, and I'd refer you to the RHS and this National Garden Scheme King's Fund report if you want to read about that more. Some great information out there. So how does that all sort of translate into the garden retail sector? So I've outlined the estimated sort of commercial value of the sector and talked about the sort of health and well-being benefits. So what I want to do is explain a little bit more about how garden centres as retail spaces have evolved to become such attractive destination retail environments for all ages, but particularly for the elderly. We estimate that there are around 2,500 garden centres in the UK. We don't actually know the actual number because there's so many of all shapes and sizes across the country. You probably know where your nearest centre is. Most people will have one within their community or will have one within a short commute anyway. And as I mentioned earlier, many of these centres have developed from plant nurseries, so they will often have the benefit of land, and that's probably a luxury that many high street retailers don't have. They're usually out of town and often need transport to get to them, but that doesn't seem to impede their popularity. So what I wanted to do was sort of take you through a journey of going through a garden centre, and sort of explain about how it's designed to be inclusive for everybody, I would argue. So to start with, car parking. As I mentioned, lots of them have their own land, and so car parking is generally not a problem at all, and it'll often be free. So you've immediately got a win-win there. But when they're designing their car park spaces, they're usually designed to be wider than the recommended minimum size. And so it's more easy for people to be able to get in and out of their car if they're having mobility issues. There's always plenty of disabled spaces, and they're usually by the front entrance as well. And again, they would normally over-index on the number of disabled spaces. Larger garden centres, or we would refer to them as destination centres, will also, somewhere within their garden centre, they'll have coach and bus parking, because many coach companies put on day trips to garden centres for their customers who are no longer driving. So that's an immediate, the first port of call. And then as soon as you walk up to the doors, they would generally have automatic doors. Now, there's two reasons for this. Obviously, it makes it easier for anybody who has mobility issues to just get through the door. But secondly, a lot of garden centres are big glass houses, which are incredibly expensive to heat. So from the owner's point of view, there's also a cost efficiency there if they can keep the doors as closed as often as they can. So there's a dual purpose there, but obviously it does make it more mobile and more accessible. You will always find free wheelchairs at a garden centre. As soon as you go through the door, a free wheelchair, there'll be plenty of free wheelchairs around. And I recently took my mother-in-law to, there's an enormous garden centre called Bent's Garden Centre, which is just on the outskirts of Manchester near Warrington. My mother-in-law suffers from late-stage Parkinson's, so her mobility is really not that great at all. But I know that I can take her there, I'll find a space near the door, I can get a wheelchair, I can get her in, and I know that she will not feel like she's being too much of a burden. She's having a good time and she's enjoying herself, and she's very happy to go there. And then once inside, aisles within the stores are generally wide. And also you'll find that garden centres tend to be all on one level. So there's not too many stairs to have to worry about. But if they are on different levels, you will always find ramps. Ramps obviously will be more suitable for wheelchairs, anybody with a Zimmer frame, but also pushchairs as well. But we wouldn't recommend, or many of our garden centres would not have something like a stair lift, because that then becomes a burden. You've then got to find somebody to operate the stair lift. It's often slow, and then the person who needs it feels like they're an inconvenience. So ramps are always so much better. Toilets. I know we mentioned toilets a little bit earlier on, but toilets are definitely a consideration when somebody's designing or refurbing garden centres, and they will always have more than the legal minimum toilets, and they will again over-index on disabled toilets as well to ensure that there's enough for everybody. And I just thought I'd share this picture with you, because some garden centres will even go the extra mile to make the toilets more interesting. This, believe it or not, are the urinals in a garden centre, again in the northwest, called Barton Grange Garden Centre near Preston. This is a little bit of an old photograph here, because if you look carefully on the top, you'll see that it's offering a cooked breakfast for £2.95. Now, I really don't think that they're going to be able to afford to do that at the moment, but yeah. But that does bring me on to my next point, because obviously restaurants are hugely important to garden centres. And they can often account for around 25% of a garden centre turnover. And so regardless of the weather, you'll always find a good garden restaurant, a good garden centre restaurant is always going to be busy. But the menu is also often designed to have special offers, like the special cooked breakfast. But they'll have offers for people who may be on a budget, or they'll be encouraging loyalty or repeat custom. And that would obviously be in addition to all the lovely cakes and the afternoon tea offers that they've got on as well. So it's very enticing. But practically, tables and chairs will be movable so that they can accommodate wheelchairs and high chairs as well. But interestingly, many garden centres had gone down the route of self-service cafeteria style restaurants. But interestingly, since lockdown, one of the hangovers from that is that lots of them have actually went to table service and have now actually retained that. And that's obviously better for people who maybe have difficulty carrying a tray to their tables. So there's a huge amount of things that are also designed. I'm sure there's a lot more to that as well. But I think one of the things, you know, we have to remember is that plants are also at the heart of a garden centre. And, you know, they'll provide a welcoming and uplifting experience when you visit. And we've already talked about the benefits of green spaces. Plants are usually the first thing you see as you walk through the door. And they're always going to be in sort of tip-top condition, to inspire you with ideas for your own sort of green spaces. You know, but fresh air and those outside spaces are commonplace, but obviously you'll also see this is a sort of covered plant area as well. So but with so much outside space, that does sometimes work against garden centres. So if the weather's not suitable, there's always plenty going on inside. So just to talk quickly about sort of products that are available as well. I mean, obviously there's huge numbers of sort of gardening based products, but within gardening ranges you will find lightweight tools are generally part of the sort of standard offer, and they're obviously going to be suitable for people who have less strength or perhaps dexterity. But the interesting thing is that they're not necessarily promoted as accessible gardening tools or for the elderly example. They're just part of the standard range. But having said that, I think there is still a lot more that we could do as an industry to develop a greater range of tools to keep people gardening for longer, definitely. I think, and that's where I sort of laid down that challenge for Susan. I think, you know, that'd be an interesting sector for her to have a look at and see if that sort of beautiful and useful form and function, you know, see how well we're doing, and perhaps it could be improved upon. I think also in terms of availability in stores over the last 10 to 15 years, and certainly more recently with the sort of cost of living crisis, the whole grow your own and self-sufficiency, the drive towards self-sufficiency has seen an increase in products such as raised beds. And obviously raised beds are going to be of benefit to anybody who has trouble sort of bending down. And again, it's another product that will keep people gardening for longer. But garden centres are not just about gardening. I'm sure if you've been to one lately, you'll know that it's not just about gardening. There's a huge diversification in there now. You know, gifting, clothing, books, tableware, homeware, home scent is a massive market, and Christmas, obviously. The list goes on. And you'll also find concessions as well, often targeting a similar customer base. So people like Pavers Shoes, Crafters Companions, Edinburgh Alden Mill. And all of those things combined together really do make those garden centres an all year round destination for anybody really, all people. Just wanted to touch on customer service as well. I know you were sort of talking about that, I think, just when we came back after lunch, but customer service is really important to garden centres. There's usually plenty of staff to help, people who can answer questions as well. There's always help to load cars if you have to go out to the cars. I mean, you know, I'm early 50s and they offer me help and I'm always happy to accept it. So it's not, again, it's not, you know, they're not discriminating on age or anything. You know, there's always help there. And often they'll have a local home delivery service as well for bulkier items. And interestingly, garden centres will have absolutely no qualms about employing older staff. And in fact, they will see it as a benefit because particularly if they've got horticultural knowledge or interest, because they can then pass that on to colleagues and customers as well, pass that knowledge on. I just want to talk about the social importance of garden centres as well. We do have a few sort of larger commercial chains of garden centres, but there are still plenty of independently family-owned businesses who run garden centres, and as such they really do sort of see themselves as part of the community and demonstrate a commitment to being sort of social hubs for groups within their area. Having said that, you know, it's not only the family-run businesses that see that. Those big commercial businesses also recognise the importance of the commercial benefit of being a community hub as well. And to that extent, you'll often find that they'll employ an events manager, and events will be part of their core business plan. So it's not just about the retail offer, it's about the event offer as well, all designed to attract a wider community audience. So you referred to it in one of your examples earlier, actually, Ailsa, you know, examples of things that will happen at a garden centre. There could be yoga workshops, there could be knit and natter, they could have art workshops. They'll often have family-friendly initiatives as well, gardening tips, and of course, Christmas displays and Santa's Grotto is a massive draw for very much a multi-generational family groups coming into the centres. This last winter, winter warm spaces as well. I think, interestingly, this is anecdotally, but those garden centres who were near bus stops seem to do better over winter this year because they were seen as winter warm spaces. Yeah, so, and also just on that, in terms of community space, I refer to Bent's Garden Centre as well. I mean, they actually have their own Bent's community allotments just across the road from the garden centre. They've got this whole space. They've got 40 allotments plots, 4 of which have been donated to local schools and 2 to their staff and colleagues. But of course, if you have a plot, you get a discount at the garden centre. So there's always a benefit on the other side. And this is actually my local garden centre that I'm showing a picture of here. This is St Peter's Garden Centre in Worcester. And you'll see that there's Poppy's Farm and there's also a yurt. So that yurt is a sort of semi-permanent feature now, and it's to be hired out for, you can hire it out for parties and events, but it also forms part of this sort of Poppy's Farm initiative, where a new animal and wildlife area where adults and children can sort of enjoy an adventure into wildlife and nature. So real diversification there. And it's just a demonstration really of how garden centres are, you know, trying to attract all ages and all demographics of the population. And we're working very hard to sort of continue that going forward. So finally, just in terms of where we sit now and sort of how can we improve what we do going forward. I mentioned there's, you know, there's lots of old stock garden centres. So that scenario that I painted at the, you know, about the accessibility isn't necessarily always the case. There's still plenty of stock out there that needs to be converted and be made more accessible. I think there's a lot that we can do with packaging. Small print is a bugbear of mine. I love that idea of the magnifying glass actually, but we shouldn't need the magnifying glass. The packaging should have the space to have the information on, and easy opening, easy closing, again, probably needs some work on. I think there's probably more work we can do on easier, lightweight tools to allow sort of easier for dexterity, you know, when people have problems with dexterity. I think just moving outside of this, there's a lot that we need to do to be more diverse. There's definitely room for us to embrace a broader range of people from socioeconomic and different ethnicities within society. There's probably some unconscious bias that plays at play in our plant selection, you know, across the UK, but garden centres have started to sort of tune into that a little bit more to be more diverse in their range of plants and respond to their sort of local demographics. And we're working very hard as an industry to work towards that. And finally, you know, I mentioned that there's a lot of family businesses in the sector, so succession planning is probably a bit of an issue. It is happening, but it's not always guaranteed, and we're obviously concerned that the next generation don't want to take over, and we see mass consolidation in the marketplace. So I'm going a little bit off piece there, but I just wanted to round it all off and just give you a sort of an overview of the world that I inhabit. So there you go. Pleased to take any questions.